so much. Just, it's working, yeah? So, Buju, Badabin de Kwe, Indigenous Cost, and Anishinaabe Kwe, Gagoon, and the Dam, Gitiganza Bing, Ingamig. So, my name's Megan. I'm Ojibwe and Italian from up there, right north of the Great Lakes. My family's from a place called Gule Bay and Garden River. And Manoba Madziwian is actually an Ojibwe word, and it's the core value of what it means to seek a good life or to live well. So that's where that comes from. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation and happy to share work with you today. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'm up to. We good over here? Yeah? Okay. So in my work, I really want to think about what I think about as the central possibility and challenge of the 21st century. And that is that we are living in and needing to transform the Anthropocene. That is that we live in a particularly unique time in the history of the Earth and the history of human communities. And I think a lot about how should education contribute to broad-scale socio-ecological change. We heard about some of that that's coming. I come to this from a family who survived boarding schools in the United States and Canada, meaning that I have a historic relationship with education, that education hasn't always been the source of social good for some of us. And so I think a lot about how can education contribute to families, communities, and the Earth's thriving, and taking seriously that although we now sometimes think that, of course, that's what we're after, most people actually think about those harms as a long time ago. But I have 2 sisters and a brother who went to boarding school alive today. Okay, so it's not actually a long time ago. It's the things that we're all still grappling with now. And in the United States, those schools didn't fully close until the 1980s. So when we think about the real histories that are shaping people's experiences both now, it's not a distant past. So I think about that a lot. And really what I'm after is what forms of teaching and learning do we need? What actually would help us support thriving in the coming decades? And how are we better at really anticipating what is education for, given the kinds of challenges and opportunities we might have? So what I'm going to try to do is kind of do three parts of my talk today. I'm going to give you some big picture ideas, issues and possibilities, kind of give you a sense of how I think about the grand world. I'm going to give you an overview of a project that is kind of my, I have 2 sort of major projects right now. One is Learning in Places, the other is Indigenous STEAM. Today I'm going to talk about Learning in Places mostly, but they speak to each other all the time. And then I'm going to try to sink into some data and some examples for part 3. So here's the big thing that I'm after. I have been studying human cognition about the natural world for going on 25, 30 years. Apparently, I look younger than I am. Thank you, Joe, for that. And really, I've been after these 2 models, along with a bunch of colleagues, so I don't do this on my own. On this left here shows you the difference between a cognitive infrastructure where humans are a part of the natural world versus apart from. Okay? And we have studied this from little kids all the way up to elders, across national contexts, across cultural communities. And these 2 different cognitive models predict all kinds of things, including how human communities start to organize themselves, how they make decisions, what they think is important to attend to, or what we might call our socio-ecological systems. Okay, so for me, the interplay between real-life socio-ecological systems and core cognitive models has been what I've been up to for a really long time. One of the things that's important to know is that power and historicity sits at the core of these, and if we think over long scales of human time, that becomes really obvious, but it is playing out again, and it's going to play out in climate change in the coming decades. So for me, one of the things that's important to recognize is that our current forms of education, largely, in at least PK-12, it's actually better in higher ed, are built on and teach apart from models. Okay, we've infrastructured actually our educational systems to be built on apart from models. And what we can see is a huge shift in American childhood. This is actually global childhood too, but I'm going to focus on the US. Is that we've gone from actually outdoor time being a staple of childhood, and over the last 60 years, we're down to 4 to 7 minutes in unstructured outdoor time for the average American child now. Okay? We've studied our representational infrastructure. I tell people all the time, just Google ecosystems. Okay? Partly what has happened is that when we represent the natural world, humans are absent from it. That's what we mean by apart from. It's come to structure our content learning. High schools are based on lab sciences, right? Not field-based sciences. I'm not suggesting lab sciences are bad. I'm talking about its totality, okay? And it's not the same in actually every country. So lab-based sciences and indoor models have become the things that we infrastructure. And part of what we know about apart from reasoning is that it actually leads to kind of fragmented human reasoning, not systems reasoning. And part of what I'm after is what does it look like to actually help us all think about complex socio-ecological systems and move from kind of binary forms of thought to a multiplicities of thought. Part of that reason is that we know that the more people have an apart of model, the more likely they are to make sustainable decisions, and the more likely they're able to make collective benefit decisions, right, rather than its individual interests. The last thing I'll just say, because I'm going to say a couple other things, is really what you can think about this over long scales of time. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but I really dig them. I think they do interesting things to think about how we've created a kind of systemic sedimentary bias that has had multiplying health impacts if you look over many decades. And things like stress and cortisol and microbiome diversity. And it's not just our physical health. We often talk about going outside as kind of recreation now and where people get exercise. We're actually talking about microbial health. Literally, the human microbiome changes depending upon how much time you spend outside, right? So all kinds of things connected to mental health. So here's the thing. If you haven't seen this Ed Week article, it was great. We are also living in a time where young people know there's a lot of stuff up, but their schools aren't teaching them about it, okay? And partly this point about mental health for young people is skyrocketing, particularly in the United States. If you haven't seen the most recent CDC reports, they're staggeringly devastating, okay? So we're seeing 57% increase in a decade of teen girls' extreme distress. On the right here, these are suicide rates. And what you can see is that over time, some communities are actually increasing, but overall. And for me, part of why this becomes really important is the population that commits suicide the most in the United States is American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. Part of why I think about that, and for those of you who know me, even though I'm going to talk about learning places, you're going to see where we're going to get here. We really think about power and historicity in the United States. We live in an educational system that is producing Indigenous absence. Only 50% of states in the United States require teaching anything about Native people. And 87% of those standards are pre-1900. So we've produced a society that thinks about Indians as a long time ago, if they think about us at all, okay? What we know is the number one reason that people develop severe mental health issues like suicidation is an inability to project a future authentic self. You stick a kid in a school for their PK-12 and never once talk about them. It's asking a lot to imagine a future. So when I think about these things, the combination of climate anxiety plus these kinds of dimensions about what we're actually teaching kids, you can start to understand why it probably makes a ton of sense for us to see the scales that we do. Just to say, those are standards. But here's teacher reports, and I'm not going to say all of them, but just to say, by 8th grade, 73% of teachers say they never or once a year mention Native people. In math, it's up to 88%, right? So if you're a kid, and again, you're engaged in all kinds of disciplinary learning, but you're not sure towards what ends or whether or not your communities are connected to it at all, this becomes a way to start understanding the impacts. Here's the thing, and then we'll move on to this, but it's partly important for you all to understand. If we think about climate change and adaptation, this absence actually is a problem for everybody, not just Native kids. So if those of you would see, this is my favorite map ever made, up here on the left. The purple are indigenous territories governed by indigenous peoples across the globe. Most people have no idea that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous territories. If we think about ecological rebuilding, you're talking about being engaged with indigenous peoples. A quarter of all land is in indigenous hands, and 95% of climate change hotspots are in our territories. So if we're talking about adaptation and mitigation for the next coming decades, we're absolutely talking about indigenous peoples. But this is not the thing that most people learn at all. I'm sure this is news to many of you, and you should not feel bad about that. Point is it's a systemic absence that everybody is learning. And it's bad for young people. Good news is, I have to tell you, I never thought in my lifetime I would see this. The last 2 years, the White House is committed to elevating indigenous knowledge and requiring all federal agencies to honor sovereignty and engage with indigenous knowledges. Currently, our school system does not fulfill anybody's capacity to do this, right? So there's an interesting way in which even high-level federal policy, as well as the UN, by the way, all of the highest-level UN documents are also requiring this. So for me, I think a little bit about, and you're going to see this, what does it look like to shift our models of education in multiple ways so that our young people are prepared for this and this? So this is from the most recent UN report on climate change, and I found it to be a stunning representation, partly for us to understand where we are right now and where we will be. So this is a heat index, but I just think it's really important for us to think about what is going to happen in the next 50 to 70 years, and who is going to have to learn how to navigate and think about it. And right now, we're in a really important time in the next 10 to 20 years. Lots of things are going to happen. But regardless, forms of life are going to dramatically change. We heard about AI dramatic changes. Food production is a really big deal, right? Extreme heat is a big deal. The scale of human migration that is going to come in the next 20 to 40 years is the largest in human history. We will have huge remixes of human communities. So what does it look like for our kids to know and be able to adapt to the kinds of shifting social relations? The UN prioritizes equity and inclusion. Again, I just think it's interesting for us to think about this. And the UN uses this language, which I wish they would shift it a little bit. But partly what they have argued is that integrating climate adaptation into social protection programs, which education is a social protection program, according to them, improves resilience. Right now, I know that there are some people in the room who have been doing climate education for a long time, but if we look at our standards and we look at the way that US education has prioritized or not climate education, we're going to have to shift pretty significantly in order to prepare young people for coming times. So for me, there's big, big picture. What am I thinking about and why? Is really to understand that science education has both historically been shaped by power and historicity, but it actually is a major actor in how people will come to understand the world, and might actually be a major actor in the unfolding world. And I think that partly what you all probably know, but we often underestimate, is science is central to civic life. Post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, people were like, post-pandemic, everyone's like, yep, okay, got that. But we can see that actually science and scientific understanding is central to civic life and to policymaking and or bad policy decision-making, just to say. And that when we think about workforce development and the professions, right, increasingly, all professions will probably have a kind of scientific literacy that is quite different and has been in a long transition since the 60s and 70s in our educational system. And here's the issue. Science and social studies are not prioritized in American education. You all probably know this, but I unfortunately feel like I can't not give talks and remind everyone about this, is that we can often think about all these fabulous design work. We all do really interesting instructional work, and the problem is that we're actually fighting over very small amounts of instructional time. If you just want to look at these, so we have huge amounts of reading and math compared to social studies and science in a given day. And then I'll just show you a couple of others. And it shifted significantly, and in my opinion, the wrong direction, right? We actually used to teach more science and social studies in the 2000s, just 10 or 20 years ago, than we do now. And it's a really challenging thing to start thinking about what are we prioritizing and why. And here's the less good news. Children of color and kids in high, free, and reduced lunch schools get no science some weeks. About a third Say some weeks, but not every week. Okay, so we're not even talking about reduced. In the last decade, we've taken science and social studies out of weekly learning. If we think about what's coming, science and civics is probably central to life. So, and I think one of the challenges that we have, where we'll get to, is we've thought about these disciplinary divides in a way that actually don't make tons of sense. By the way, you read about things, right? Literacy development is not based in no content. But we have an instructional system, particularly at PK5, same teacher, all subjects, split up in ways that actually isn't aligned with the best of what we understand about human learning, and much about what the challenges are of teaching and learning anyway, at least for elementary teachers. So, okay, I'm going to move. So those are big, high-level things. I worry about these things. I think it's really important. And then what do we do? Because these things can also be quite overwhelming. And so for me, I've been after developing models of education that I think could be a potential solution. And so I'm going to tell you about this project called Learning in Places. And we've really been after interdisciplinary field-based education. And let's go. So this project was co-designed and was after scaling transformative educational models and practice, including professional learning. We built it with educators, with families, with community partners, and we're after cultivating equitable, culturally grounded socio-ecological systems learning and sustainable decision-making, utilizing field-based instructional models. And this is focused on pre-K to fifth grade, although we have people in middle school, high school, and even undergrad using this, and informal environments too. Part of what you should hear is, I wanted to see is, could we get a model of education where you had routine outdoor engagement? People often say to me, well, but how would you do this in urban schools? I started doing this on the west side of Chicago, just to be clear. It was not in some pristine natural environment. There's lots you can do in any neighborhood, in any place, right? It's not a only go out to pristine nature. Just want to say, here's our leadership team so far. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project, but I just want to say this work is done by a whole crew of people. And I just want to acknowledge Mary Starr's in the room. She's our partner here in Michigan. Woohoo, thank you, Mary. And just to say that these partnerships with folks like Mary is actually the only way you get to build models like this and see if they're any good. So just want to thank you, Mary, for your leadership. She keeps us honest about this and sometimes says to me, use words that I don't know what you mean. So I appreciate that. So here's a brief history of this project as a way to get in. This started in, we got our first NSF grant in 2015, and for students in this, I submitted like 2 or 3 times before I ever get funding, so just don't stop with good ideas, you gotta submit multiple times. And we co-designed our first storyline over 2 years, took us a minute, and then we piloted in the first year in 17 and 18, the academic year, and then we were in the middle of full implementation and COVID hit, and so this was probably the more devastating kind of experience as a learning scientist that I've ever had, because we were ready to go with like that perfect evidential base, and then you can't do place-based education on Zoom. It doesn't work, just to say, right? Not in the way that we designed. So we had to shift. I'm grateful we are now in phase 2, and we're sort of picking back up in a post-COVID world, where we're now in multiple states, kind of redesigning to be interdisciplinary, and next year will be a new pilot phase. So just to have a sense of the project I'm going to show you. So in this Learning in Places, what did we design? We talk about it as a materials ecosystem, and there are really 4 components. Not all of this you need to make sense of, because there's a lot here, just going to forewarn you about that. But I'm going to try to give you the high level, and then we're going to focus on a couple aspects today. So we start with our rhizome. Most of us are plant nerds, so and we like to lose mostly. So we picked up rhizomes. And then the other major component is frameworks. And I'll tell you, we didn't have frameworks until later on in the project, and I'll say more about that. Our storyline, much like everyone's storylines, although ours have some specific components, and then learning engagements, which are bundled lesson plans, really. So here is our rhizome. I'm not going to say tons about this right now, but I guess what I want you to hold is that for us, the background of learning really sits in these nature-cultural relations and dynamics of power and history. And then we are built around these three other major components: culture, families, and community, socio-ecological systems, and then the practices of field-based learning, okay? I'm going to show you a framework. Again, this part is a lot, so if you feel a little like, okay, that's way too much, don't worry, you don't need to hold all of it. I'll get in. We have a ton of different frameworks, and part of how these frameworks came to be is like educators essentially said to us a few years in, this is awesome, it's a paradigm shift, it's not how our schools are currently infrastructured, you need to help me with a different set of tools to hold these big ideas, because otherwise I get sucked back in to the ideas of how schools are currently run. So we ended up with this kind of visual vocabulary as well as these shorter documents that are a couple pages long. But I just want to say across the rhizome, there's a bunch of different frameworks. Here is what they have in them. So there's the focal phenomena of the framework. And then there's a series of kind of key purposes from learner sense making, how do you make sense of students sense making through this lens of this phenomena, all the way up through educator reflection. This was really, educators wanted help. I didn't tell people, I told someone else this earlier today. In our experience, educators love assessments. It's probably not really how they experience assessments all the time, partly because our assessments aren't punitive. They're actually helpful to transforming practice. But ours also end up involving a series of appendices so that people can really apply these ideas to kid thinking, to classrooms for both planning and instruction, to things around assessments for students, but also educators across them. So we now have a lot of them, okay? There's about 32. These continue to get evolved. Don't need to make sense of all of them, but there's been a bit of educators have said, I need this one, and we evolve them, right? So there are kind of an accumulation of them over time, and we're continuing to build them. Storylines, right? So I've given you rhizome, now frameworks, now our storylines. We actually have 4 storylines, what we call our classroom storyline. We have a specific garden storyline. We call it our family storyline. And then schoolyard redesigns. One of the things that we've been after is redesigning and thinking about what if we thought about school designs as having outdoor living classrooms as a part of every school. People are like, that's great, but I don't know how to do that, and my playground is filled with little plastic pieces. So how do I do living laboratories on playgrounds as they are? We've helped actually develop with a number of urban landscape architects about how would you go about actually planning to redesign your schoolyards. So those are the 4. I'm going to walk you through this. This is our classroom storyline, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. But here's what I want to say about holding this. So this middle part of the classroom storyline, if it were not field-based instruction, what if we didn't do this outside and not only inside? To be totally honest, it would look like much of what we see in many science class, in many NGSS aligned science classrooms now. There's some important distinctions, but I'll just say that. But part of what I want to be clear about is what comes before that and what comes after it. We think are fairly unique, although I'm happy to actually see lots that are coming. And part of the before is place-based and emergent. And we're going to talk about the kind of affective landscapes that happen through these processes of outdoors. And then what NGSS is called communicating explanations and proposing solutions, we call world making and change making, right? How do you really change the worlds that you live in? Here's an example of family storylines. The only thing I want to say about this until we get a little bit further, there's a weird thing that happens in the United States that, and it took us a little while to help educators realize people do science in multiple languages around the world. You don't have to speak English to do good science. But if we look at our curricular materials, most of what we send home to families is in English, right? And so if you don't actually produce materials and you're doing family tools in home-based languages, you're actually bringing that kind of language distinction into families in ways that are counterproductive to family and kid engagement. So we've worked really hard to have, right now we have English, Mandarin, and Spanish. We're also, I didn't put them up here, but Lakota and Ojibwe. But we actually work with districts to try to move their homework tools into the languages of their districts. Here's our garden storylines. You don't need to know much about this other than you'll see it's different. Turns out when you have gardens, they're seasonal things you have to do. So that's organized a bit differently. And then I mentioned this is our co-designing places for outdoor learning. Okay, I'm going to tell you about our learning engagement, and then we're going to turn to actually understanding this model. I will tell you that we have 10 modeled learning engagements and learning in places, 80 plus. I think we're actually more up to like 120, but of actual lesson plans, people often want to know this. And people variably use these things. I'm not going to tell you about the next place, but I've just walked through each of these components as the materials ecosystem. So you have hopefully you have a bigger sense of like, okay, here are the 4 components. And people ask me this a lot. So we've used this, I said this before, but just to say, right now we have 34 teachers, 60 plus families that have been co-designers. We're in 19 preschools right now too, and lots of pre-service, in-service, and other folks. So it's starting to spread. Part of what you should know is when we started this, it needed to be curricularly neutral, but we wanted a model, meaning that our school partners said, I'm adopting these other curriculums and it's already gone through, but I really want field-based education in here. Can you help us figure out how we can have adaptation models? So what you should know is that people use different components of this. Some people are using it all, and it is their classroom, and it is their curriculum, hands down. Other people use parts of it, okay? What I'm going to show you today is a little bit of the classroom storyline and getting into a few key dimensions. And tell you why I think this place matters. So we're going to look at a little bit of indoors versus outdoors and the way in which we're seeing some outcomes around socio-ecological systems learning. We're going to think about civics and agency. And a core part of our storyline is that we move through what we call should we questions to ethical deliberation and decision making to change making. And for us, these should we questions actually motivate investigation questions. Part of what we need is people actually using scientific evidence to answer should we questions, but it's not currently how we actually structure schools. We often don't give kids opportunities to grapple with hard should we questions that motivate evidential reasoning in particular ways. So we're after that. And I'm really after these affective landscapes, or what we often call social emotional learning, and what we're going to call wonder and awe, and then equity, power, culture, and identity, and family. Okay, so first I'm going to teach you to see this graphic. So one of the things about this is we've designed this to be porous. So one of the challenges I think we have about learning environments is we think about schools as the center of life. And that's a nice institutional framework, but it's not actually a human learning framework. It's not actually how human learning works. Human beings navigate multiple settings across their day and make sense of that. Okay, but usually what we do is we assume schools, the institution, is the center of a theory of learning. For us, we've been after thinking about what does it mean to take seriously the best of what we know about human learning and think about classrooms as porous. So we have in the field, we have in learning environments, we mean inside classrooms. And then we have, and for all the NGSS folks, I just want to be clear so that you can see NGSS baked into all of this. And then we have with families and communities. So our storyline actually is deliberate about facilitating learning experiences across all 3 contexts. Part of why I said this before, but part of what I'm after is transforming our models of family and community engagement. This is one of our frameworks. Right now, we largely have an institutional compliance model. In fact, that's why we have things like truancy problems. Truancy is a paradigm where we criminalize children and their families for not attending school. We have a compulsory attendance system in the United States. It's illegal not to send your kids to school. And partly, I'm not suggesting I don't want kids to go to school, but we should probably be thinking about whether or not constructing families and children as the problem is getting us very far, okay? So for us, we've really been trying to think about what happens when you move from institutionally driven compliance to partnerships with families and communities. And I want to say something about this. I'm not suggesting that this is what educators want. I'm saying this is what we've institutionalized. Anyone has, I have a high schooler. I see their teachers for 3 minutes once a year, right? That is not a model that suggests that deep relationships with me matters for my kids' learning, right? And it's not that much better for elementary teachers at this point. So partly we've been after what does it look like to change that and what are ways that we could transform it. You all know this, but this is a framework this is from NGSS, but we've really worked hard at trying to put what does it mean to understand human learning from culture and identity pathways. And you don't need to make sense of all this, but I'm giving you a sense of what the frameworks look like. For us, these frameworks, by the way, this is all free online, all of it. You can get any of it. But part of what we really wanted to say is what will it take for educators to really understand this, right? To take seriously that all science is culturally laden, that neutrality is actually not real, and that most edge scientists actually know and account for that perspective and point of view, right? That it's not so bad to have it, but we don't afford that for non-experts or children, right? We're moving on this, but I think it's actually quite important still. And so for us, one of the key design features in Learning in Places is what we call family tools. Being really different, I'm deliberately not calling it homework. And for us, it's really been about changing the perception of what homework is for. Kill and drill homework is not working. We've had evidence for a long time. It doesn't work. It doesn't actually improve instruction. It doesn't improve outcomes. And it's one of those core places that we enact relationships, right? So I said this about, like, do we send English homework home to families who don't speak English in their household? We've just recreated power dynamics by that paradigm over and over again. And so we've really tried to change this. The other key thing that I hear from educators all the time is they really want to do culturally responsive or equitable instruction. But they'll say things like, but I have kids from 16 different ethnic backgrounds that speak 12 different languages, and how could I possibly know all that? Part of that is a model that presumes you're not in relationships with families and communities to help think about those things. It presumes that educators are supposed to know all those things beforehand. So we've developed family tools that are actually robustly across instruction. Sometimes we do these cultural connects at the beginning of instruction, and then that's it. And we do the real science afterwards. In our model, we're really deliberate about trying to actually have a family storyline that goes alongside the classroom storyline so that kids and families are actually doing investigations at home that parallel what's happening in schools. You might be like, I don't know if I can get my kids and families to do that. I don't know if they would do it. Here's the thing. At first, they don't, partly because homework sucks at home. How we got here is because our families said, please save us from Zoom hell during the pandemic and help us figure out what to do with our kiddos. And this has actually got developed with families that said, this is how we could do this. This would be really helpful. And they started doing it. And then we integrated it actually into classroom instruction as a back and forth. And it transforms classroom instruction over time. The last one of seeing this before we get to actual data, I think anyway, is this piece that I think is quite important. It's probably a little bit more unique than other things, is that we're really after should we questions. Should we questions is kind of core to civic reasoning. For those folks who may know about civic reasoning, the should we paradigm is central to how civics education functions, and it's a developmental kind of trajectory that all kids needs. Kids get asked ethical questions across development. It's one of the things that human beings do. They try to figure out what they should do about things. Largely in K-12, we mute this in relationship to deep intellectual work, okay? So we've been after, how could we do this? And for us, how we developed this was with a series of natural scientists who engage in all kinds of natural resource management and said, well, what are your key practices? What do you do on the job? And then we asked, well, why couldn't we have kids be doing that? But it's largely not what we've done so far. So this framework has been, and now it's all over the place. OpenSciEd, we partnered with OpenSciEd to integrate this as well. But this trajectory of should we, I would argue in a PK5 setting, actually meets a developmental need that we usually put in classroom management that is quite distinct from intellectual engagement, okay? All right, so what are we learning? I'm going to show you Just 3 kind of clips of data about what are we learning from this model and where are we in refining it. And the first one that I want to show you is what we call beginnings. So lots of people call beginnings different kinds of things, whether they're launches or hooks, or our field has been kind of thinking about how we begin for a long time. And for us, I guess partly what I wanted to say, and it didn't show up here. Let me just see. Oh, it did. There you go. That's this part of the storyline. And I said that we do it quite differently. For us, we started with the idea of wondering and awe, right? Sometimes we call that motivation, interest, engagement, but we've actually been after these feelings of wonder and awe. Here's one reason. If you feel wonder and awe about the natural world, you're more likely to care about it and make particular decisions about it. So we're also after that sustainable decision making that lots of psychologists have studied those feelings. But we've started with kids going on wandering walks in their communities, around their school buildings, and beginning to notice the phenomena that they need to study in classrooms out in the world around them. I often tell the story, a long, long time ago, I was teaching about carrying capacity in a classroom where probably 70% of the kids had families that engage in subsistence practices. They hunted and fished in order to feed their families. And it was weeks in to this unit, and I had a kid say, wait, is this like a real thing? Like, could this actually happen? Like, could the population of deer actually like bottom out and we wouldn't have any more to eat? And for me, that is partly what changed my trajectory as an educator. I had all the right intentions. I thought I was doing all kinds of things to connect. And still weeks in, the idea that the phenomena we were teaching about was real in the world was that profoundly disconnected. So for us, this place-based kind of emergent walking, literally going outside and wondering, helps to actually ground the phenomena that we care about in everyday life. The other thing about our model is science tells histories of places, right? It tells the history of a world in particular kinds of ways. One of the challenges of socio-ecological systems reasoning is being able to think across different temporal and spatial scales. We have this framework to help educators know about what are the different temporal and spatial scales that are actually important to attend to in kids' reasoning. And one of the things that you should know is that in classrooms, future time is often missing. What we often talk about is job time. And while we need to talk about job time, it's a lot to ask a fourth grader to learn something so they can have a good job later. Part of what we know is that actually when we think about future time, children are increasingly not worrying about their economic well-being in the same kind of way because they don't know how to make sense of that the world is collapsing and there's this thing called climate change. We're not actually centrally helping them understand what mitigation and adaptation will be in a real sense. So they're getting these two stories. My son recently said he's in environmental engineering. He was like, why do people not tell us that actually these jobs could help us figure out how to mitigate? But he didn't really, that didn't click for him until, well, it clicked earlier for him, but he didn't really get that storyline until college, right? The other thing that we're after here is normalizing Indigenous peoples' time. So I started here a little bit to say most of us don't actually contribute to Indigenous peoples' time as always being present. Remember that piece about biodiversity as well as land management? If you're in the United States thinking about land management and not thinking about Native people, then you're probably actually not understanding sovereignty or self-determination. Even in states where there are no federally recognized tribes, there are federal treaty responsibilities to those territories. So not thinking about tribes is actually part of ongoing inequalities in the United States. So for us, we're trying to build in all of those kinds of components here. So I want to talk about wonder and awe specifically for a couple of minutes. So one of the things that from a cognitive perspective, there is affective states right before you think things, right? So psychologically, that's somewhat how thinking works. And Socrates said this a long time ago, that all thinking begins with wonder, with questions, but there's a precognitive emotion that happens in the world for humans And what we've been after is what would it mean to really shape and reshape the affective landscapes of learning? And partly what you should hear is my gentle critique of interest and motivation, or interest and engagement, is probably not sufficient for the kinds of emotional landscapes that children need, given the kinds of things that are happening. It's partly why climate anxiety is through the roof, right? Tons of interest, not tons of support around different affective landscapes. By the way, if anybody's ever felt like something was really amazing, felt awe about something, you literally have a physiological response when you feel awe and wonder than if you're interested, okay? So this, and by the way, when I'm talking about this, this isn't my conjectures, this is a field of psychology about this phenomena, although I believe it too. So part of what we've been after is we've been developing, and my graduate student, who is no longer a graduate student, newly minted, studied and developed this typology of wondering. And partly what we're going to talk about is the wondering at idea here. And partly we all do wondering about. In fact, science instruction asks us to wonder about things. Good science instruction does it all the time. Wondering at is kind of the affective form of wonder. Wondering whether is that ethical deliberation when we think about what should we do. And wondering with is when you do it collectively or with others rather than on solo mission. And part of what we've been studying, and I'm going to show this to you in a second. We've been studying this in learning environments. We've looked at about 98 hours of classroom instruction about this. And I'm going to show you an example. But I have to end this to be able to get to the... This is a second grade classroom. And they were on what we call a focus wondering walk, where they needed to... Kids were thinking about the history of place. They were thinking about biodiversity, and in particular, species, kinds, and behaviors, and human decision making. Okay, we're going to come back to that. But hopefully you get the point. There's a little bit of affect wonder happening here. And just to make this clear, this is from, you can see here in this transcript this kind of wondering at, where we see Nick and Sasha, baby tree, right? Nick is sort of in this discovery mode. I've never seen a baby tree like this. Whether that's true or not is not really the point here, right? There's a kind of affective wonderment happening around a simple walk. But we also see Nick start to pay attention to, what? How did a charger? Look at this, there's even a charger. Who would put, and look, there's even a charger. And part of what I want to be clear here in this very short segment, right? I said that we were after histories of places in different temporal and spatial scales. We were after different biodiversity, and we were after human decision making. Part of what we do in Learning in Places is help educators see this happen, rapid fire, in learning environments, in kids' sense making. You can also see there's wondering about, right? We see this move. It's a pine tree. I think it's an evergreen, actually, right? We see a little bit of moving and into naming. And evergreen, actually, is is not necessarily what we were all like, well, that got very formal very quickly, right? And part of what you want to see here is that there's a kind of debate and curiosity about when something was there, why did you find the shell, how long it has been here. Very quickly, you get into kind of some discursive patterns with kids trying to make sense of and see which frame works really play out. So part of what I just want to say about this is that one of the things that we've learned, and I'm going to show you some more data, is that place actively facilitates notice and wonderings in a way that motivates all kinds of questions that we typically want. But now it's located in children's places, and the demand for knowing shifts pretty dramatically. And partly what we see is this affective excitement, joy, interest tied to motivation and to know more. I will tell you, at first, some kids are like, I don't want to go outside. They've learned that learning happens indoors. So it takes a little bit, actually, for learning to learn outside to happen again. Our first beginning instructors actually typically are like, oh, this isn't going to work. I hate field trips. This is not field trips. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about routine engagement outdoors. And we have taught children that outdoors is playtime. So actually teaching them that outdoors is learning again during the school day takes a little bit of time. But once we get there, actually, we see lots of this kind of thing. So we did this implementation analysis. Dr. Sherry Wagner, this is coming from his dissertation, along with a series of other things, where we looked at the sociological sense-making, the content, along with the wonderings that I just talked about, and the place emergence. And here is what I'm going to just show you. Learning outdoors increases students' engagement with learning objectives as connected to their learning, to their local places in huge increases. We see kids spontaneously asking about and noticing content objectives that teachers have outdoors. Okay, it's a massive shift when we look outside. The second one that I want to show you is we also see a huge shift in the wondering at. Sorry, this is the awe and wonder. Okay, we do not see awe and wonder happening inside classrooms. We go outside, totally transformed. Okay, some of this might be a little duh. To be honest, if you sat and thought about it for a second, well, of course, you're outside, you get to see really cool stuff, someone is helping you understand it. Part of the point, though, is that our current landscapes don't prioritize this experience of learning at all. For those of you who are like, yeah, but can you still get to the rigor? We have lots of different evidential bases for this, but this is an example. When we look at, we also code for kids' reasoning and their content, and when we find actually the densest, most rigorous content knowledge is when there's place immersion and wondering at simultaneously. So we've seen that correlated over and over again outdoors compared to indoor classrooms, okay? All right, so I'm going to transition to family tools a little bit to show you some more evidence that wondering outside matters. We studied, when we designed this, we deliberately created indoor discussion-based family tools as well as outdoor tools in that family storyline. And I'm going to show you basically, one of the things that's important to know is that the content foci were similar. Not exactly the same, but pretty darn similar. And what we did is we coded this. This is our framework for kind of base, what we call the base conceptual relationships in ecosystems. Base reasoning about ecosystems includes places, species, and then what sometimes we call natural kinds, but understanding things like rocks, soil, wind, air, water, those kind of abiotic components. And we coded all of the family tools for the sets of relationships between these base components in ecosystems cognition. And I'm going to show you. So the red bar are with human-centric relationships. So when it was between a human and another one of those components in ecosystems cognition. The purplish and blue family is when humans were not part of it. So what I want you to notice on the left is the family discussion, when we're sitting at tables discussing with families. And on the right, same families outdoors. Here's what it looks like to shift from anthropocentric reasoning, where you're human-centered, to apart from to a part of. Okay? So this simple shift in activity structure actually changes cognition and reasoning patterns for the same families. Okay? And we get to see reasoning that we want about ecosystems here. So partly what is important is that I often have people say, well, I teach about places all the time. The shift here is in and with places, not just about places. Actually being outdoors routinely changes cognition. So I'm going to end with a return to the video we just saw. And I never talk about learning in places without doing this. So the other thing that we've been paying a lot of attention to is if you're going to open up these kinds of classrooms, there is all kinds of ethical deliberation pedagogically as well. And I'm going to show you the end of the Nick video in just a second. So for us, we've had to work hard at helping people understand how to think about power and historicity. Often what we get with educators is like, I'm not racist, or I don't want to be, right? It's versions of that. Part of what we've had to say is like, this is not about individual accusations. It's actually about understanding dynamics between peoples. And regardless, educators, if we are the best educators people in the world, we get children who come into our classrooms with all kinds of complicated ideas. And you have to figure out how to mediate them. And so we've been working on this for a while. One way that we have started doing this is what we call the difference between a behavioral stance and a sense-making stance. This is taken from Ann Roseberry and Beth Warren's work. And that what we know is that often educators interpret little kids, PK5 kids, from a behavioral stance, especially boys of color. The default assumption is that there's a behavioral problem. And what we've worked on is actually helping educators take a sense-making stance and learn what would I ask differently if I presume that I have one interpretation for this child's behavior right now, and it's something like they're not behaving right, they're not following the rules, they're not engaged, they're off task. What would it mean to act from a place where it says, this kid is making sense of something and I'm not sure what it is, so what do I do next? There's a lot of what you can interpret this as. And for us, this moment in instruction, if you can slow it down, actually opens up the opportunity to ask ethical questions pedagogically. What should we do given the kinds of dynamics? And this is the moment in instruction where all kinds of layered dynamics of power and historicity play out in interaction. So for us, just to be clear, the should we questions matter in content, but it actually matters in content, in pedagogical practice as well in this way. And so I'm going to show you, this is what I was trying to get to. I'm going to show you the end of this video. We'd just seen Nick notice the charger. And I'm going to back it up a tiny bit. We're going to watch the end of it. Turns out we have the audio of what's happening here, but that's not what I'm going to show you. What I want you to have a notice, right, of part of what just happened. And sorry, that shouldn't say turn and talk because we don't have time. Here's what I'm going to say is one of the things that we can notice right here is that Nick has actually been completely on task. He's been joyously interested. He has been paying attention. And what you can't see from his perspective is that he's been collecting so many observations. The reason he's kicking the charger is because he doesn't have any more space to pick it up. Part of what I want everyone to notice here is that we see actually a really historically normative kind of pattern unfolding here, where you can hear Nick vying for intellectual attention across here, right? He's trying to get people engaged. He was totally on point. They're in the middle of a forest preserve next to their school, and there's a charger. Why is there a charger here? Who would make that decision is what is partly he's pushing at. And part of what's important to say is that Miss River gives him the most attention now after Carly, and I know what I forgot to say. Nick is a second grade black boy, and Carly is a white girl. What we see is that Miss River actually escalates Carly's claim. Carly did not say, "You're causing me physical harm by putting dirt in my eyes." It's not what she said. She said, "You're getting dirt everywhere." Partly what is happening here is that not only is Nick having a very routinized experience where black boys and men get their bodies policed, and the presumption is that they're doing someone harm, but Carly is also learning that she can call on power to suppress a little boy. Okay? And part of the reason that we show this is that when we first started going out into Learning in Places, we saw a huge spike in boys of color getting in trouble outdoors. So I won't talk about Learning in Places anymore without this message too, right? And part of the point about this is that it's not that Miss Rivers is a terrible teacher or an awful person. Part of the point is that actually being able to see these historicized dynamics, it's little here. This is not a huge thing. It accumulating multiple times a day over a lifetime is actually how we produce systemic racism, right, and experiences. And the point is that we often say with teachers is that we've probably all experienced the Miss Rivers. We've probably been Miss Rivers, if you start thinking about it. And we've also probably felt like we needed to be Miss Rivers. And I think that one of the things people often ask me is like, well, he shouldn't have been kicking it. Maybe. Just to say that, maybe. But if she had taken up a sense-making stance instead of a behavioral stance, she would have been able to say, Nick, it's so weird. You're right. Who made this decision? Why would they have done that? And then she could have said, but let's not kick it. Let me help you carry it. There are a whole series of things that she could have done differently in that moment, even if she wanted him to stop kicking it, that would have been a very different outcome in learning. Part of why we say this is because it's happening over and over and over again in classrooms in this way, both in Learning in Places, but in many, many classrooms. These kind of racialized dynamics happen, and this is a second grader. So our point about this, and the other thing is this happened, right? I'm sure many of you remember this. When Christian Cooper asked a white woman who had her dog off her leash in New York City, and she didn't want to have to comply with those rules, and so she said, I'm going to call the police on you, right? And partly, what the point is here is that in second grade, those kinds of dynamics are already emerging in classrooms, and this is my point, that it ends up replicating power in history, even in ways we might not want. So partly our point here is that Learning in Places is trying to understand how do you take interpretive power to go from ethical design and pedagogical decision-making in this case, PK, learning environments, where things like power and historicity, as well as the real challenges of things like climate change, actually drive our pedagogical designs or our classroom learning and our decision-making about what education is for and what we should be attending to. So I'm going to end here. Partly, I think I'm not too much over, which is good for me, is to say that I started with this idea about what are our nature-culture relations and what kinds of socio-ecological systems or forms of life are we cultivating, and how do our models of education actually help us think about where we need to get to. And I'll stop.
Thank you, Megan. So now we have time for some questions. And I'd like either, if you have a really big booming voice, then you can say it really loud and booming, or I'll have the mic, and I'm gonna have Bob run the mic around. Or someone will write we'll pass the mic around for people who wanna ask questions. Go ahead, questions? Questions? First question, way over there, okay, we'll run the mic back there. I gotta get my steps in anyways, right?
I think it might be me, actually.
There we go. Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. My name's Kara Haas, and as a outdoor educator, I feel at home in your work. And the first time I read it, I said, "Oh, maybe I have a place in science education and research," because it feels like home. So thank you for that. And I was curious if you and maybe Mary could share more about what you're doing in Michigan with Learning in Places.
Did Mary tell you you had to ask that question? Well, I'll start, Mary, and then you want to share some details. We are about to start a new cohort in Michigan. We've had a few people in Michigan this year, but over the next several years, we're hoping to grow people doing Learning in Places and helping us continually evolve ed. So this summer, we'll have we start out this summer with a summer summit, and then there are seasonal PDs that people come to in a learning community with educators from across the country. And so we're always would love to have more educators who want to engage. We do have classroom educators, and we are trying to get this in schools. But we have all kinds of community-based educators and informal educators as well. So it's not a only school-based program at all. And in fact, I would argue that one of the best ways that we could potentially get CBOs and schools in partnership is through things like this. In our past states, it transformed relationships between schools and the CBOs in the neighborhoods through this. So, Mary, do you want to add any details?
Mary.
If anybody's interested in joining us, we'd love to have you. We're recruiting now for classroom teachers and all other educators, PK-5. So Laura's been with us for a couple of years already, doing a bunch of Learning Places stuff with Michigan State undergrads. So that's really cool. We're looking for anybody who wants to join us. You can send me an email. Just where's the one? Oh, register at Learning. Is that the one we should use, Megan?
Yeah.
So, and then they'll send it out to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great opportunity. The things that we've seen at the School of Marygrove and on Beaver Island and in other places across the state this 1 year have been amazing. Little people outside exploring where they live and finding strong connections to their urban and rural environments has been, it's just like watching the videos makes your heart sing. So if you want to have your heart sung, is that a word? Please feel free to join us. Kara, come on.
I'll add just 2 details about it. So we have stipends for folks to participate, and our PDs are Friday afternoons and Saturdays, partly because we're across states and there's different union laws. So we try not to position any educators in complicated positions because we have a multi-state partnership. So just to say that, those are the dates. We have them all, so be glad to have folks come. Yeah.
Other questions? Other comments?
Hi, my name is Sarah Felsing. I work for Eaton RESA, and so I work with teachers in several school districts. What I'm curious about is if a teacher was interested but felt like they didn't have any time to give up to do this in addition to what they're already doing, can this be used as their science curriculum?
Depends on the district rules, but
Okay.
yes, it sure can be.
Okay.
We have some schools that do that, others that can't do that. I'll tell you that we had some teachers, so 3 of our schools started out being able to just use this as their science curriculum, and they had a new curricular adoption, and the teachers didn't want to give it up, so they partnered with the librarian, and library time became Learning in Places time. So I think that lots of educators have figured out how to make space for it, And I think we're pretty good at helping coach through that. Usually it's because educators have seen what happens. My favorite stories about some of what happens is we've had a lot of long-term teachers who go through a phase of like, I have one teacher who said, I was in a couple years of mourning after learning in places because I spent 20 years never fathoming that my kids could do something like this or could think in this sophisticated a way. And it feels like I wasted 20 years of life. And so what we've seen is that teachers that have space to try first do better than teachers who feel like I have to squeeze this in. Because what they don't do is give enough time to try. They'll go out for 1 or 2 walks and it'll be squirrely. And they're like, never mind, I can't do this. I'm not going to get there. So it's multiple times. Yeah.
And if you want to, sign your teachers up, and they can be part of the cohort where there's a stipend and all of the supports. And that's one of the things I think, I mean, I feel like we're trying to build in Michigan, is to have teachers, educated leaders, who, when a district wants to use the materials, there's somebody local who knows how to support that, so that the changes really are continual and sustainable.
Also, because we have a network of teachers, teachers help teach other teachers. If you get to interact with a bunch of teachers who tell you, yeah, this part was hard, this part was hard, and this part was hard, but this is how I figured it out, and this is how I kept going. Part of the reason we do co-design with large amounts of teachers is so there's some of that near-peer mentoring and opening up. So, yeah.
Other comments or questions?
Hey Megan, my name is TJ Heck. I am now with Centerpoint Education Solutions, and I am tasked with building interim assessments aligned to NGSS. And you said very briefly, our families love our assessments, and our teachers love our assessments, and our kids don't feel like they're being assessed. That's a paraphraser. I'm not sure if you said that exactly. I'm curious about your assessment system and what that might look like and how you're using that to drive where your teachers are going with their instruction.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. We have really thought about, like, what does it mean to see all kinds of learning artifacts as embedded assessments? So so just to be clear, our assessment systems are probably not as robust as they need to be yet, just to be clear about that. But partly why we think about the family tools as embedded assessments is because actually if you start to use them in that way, it transforms what teachers understand kids know and as well as where they could go. But how you do that matters, right? And so for us, there's a number of really carefully designed tools all across the storyline. And then we help educators know how to use them towards their assessments and being able to do markers. The other thing is we help teachers know how to say, like, okay, I'm seeing this pattern across students. So what new learning opportunities do I need to make? So it's a little bit, so part of the way that I think that is important to hold is that we're after classroom level assessments, not always individual assessments, as a way to help instructional decisions. I was talking with Andy Anderson earlier, and one thing that I will tell you is schools have, in our experience in some of our districts, schools are not as readily sharing some of their outcomes data. So we had outcomes data in the first year where it went at the end of the school year to the beginning of the school year, and we saw a decline in any kind of summer slump, as our principals would call it. But we didn't actually get good outcome data, academic outcome data from the first round. And we haven't done a full pilot yet, so we don't actually have some of that data. It's partly why we do things like 98 hours of analysis in a really detailed way to say, can we come up with other evidence about what's happening? We also did pre and post interviews, so we have about 450 interviews with children across different pre and post across implementation. And so we can, I didn't show that data today because, but what we can do is, and what we have done is track kids' ideas with DCIs as a way to demonstrate that those DCIs are getting taken up in ever more robust ways that are aligned with some of the more performance assessments that are in NGSS already. yeah, there's more to say about that, but that's partly how we've thought about it, is really to implement all of the performance assessments inside the storyline and have teachers see them rather than have them be external.
Other questions or comments? Okay, go ahead, Emil. I'll run over there. I think so.
Everybody can hear me, right? Okay. Hi, I'm Emil. I'm a postdoc at Create. I wanted to ask, like my experience for my kids. I was teaching chemistry, so not a lot of outdoors there. But just my experience with my kids, and I take them a lot outdoors. This one looks at a flower and just look at it for like 1 hour. The other ones lose patience. They look at something else. They found a squirrel and they are chasing after it or something like that. How a teacher, actually how it looks like, how guided it is, and how teacher manages a class of 15, 20, 30 kids with different, their awe and wondering are subjective,
Mm-hmm.
right? Eventually subjective. So how does a teacher manages that, and how do you support teachers in managing different types of awe and wondering about different types of stuff?
Yeah. Well, the beginning of the storyline, you start with a series of wandering walks, and then we focus attention. So a lot of those learning engagements that I mentioned, they end up actually helping teachers start to focus kids' attention as they're in wandering walks. We also have a series of lessons where you take in all of those different noticings of kids, those collective observations of a socio-ecological system, and you start to help organize those in classrooms. So you're right that it's all over the place, but actually part of what it is teaching kids how to observe different components of ecosystems. And through practice, kids do it quite easily. I think that I appreciate the feels a little all over the place. It is a little all over the place at first. It is. But partly we use that as a way to recognize that kids are probably always noticing potentially relevant content to understanding socio-ecological systems, and that it's really a process of bringing those huge variable kinds of observations and giving them organization, just like you would do in any kind of teaching and learning environment, right? Is that you actually start to help kids organize into concepts in particular kinds of ways. And so we have a series of practices. We go from wandering walks to wandering walls. You refine, and then you start to actually help kids do focused noticings, to observation protocols. Like once you get into investigations, you collect data like anyone would outside. And really it's a facilitative process through it. It does take a little bit because, like I said, kids have learned that outdoors is for play, not for learning. So it is a process of helping kids learn to notice and wonder. But we just saw in that video, and that's a very early wandering walk, those kids were all noticing things that we had asked them to notice. So it might have been squirrely. We had baby tree over here. We had a shell over here. But the kids actually are not off task at all. And so we have a series of observation protocols that they bring back into the classroom, that porous classroom, and help teachers learn how to organize all of those kinds of different thinking. Part of what is different about this is that most teachers aren't used to teaching complex systems. They're usually driven by a particular phenomena, and so we do a bunch of work to actually help educators understand components of complex systems and to understand the different components that you might notice and to be able to map kids' ideas to kind of that academic concepts and those academic languages. And you can do it. It just takes a little bit of practice. We often engage educators with practicing scientists. My favorite is that we've worked with a series of scientists who often look like second graders when they're really excited about the phenomena they're studying, right? We sometimes think scientists are really muted or something, but at least the field-based scientists I know that are working on really deep issues around, like they get outside and they're kind of goofy and really loud about really interesting phenomena. And so we've been really deliberate about actually helping teachers see experts engaged in this practice in a way that helps them re-see kids' behavior. I'll give you one more example. Sometimes people say, like, what are should we questions? And we have this whole vignette about a class had gone for a wandering walk after it rained, and there were worms all over the sidewalk. And their should we question became, should we move worms off the sidewalk? Right? That's a second grade question about natural resource management. Actually, relocating species is like a very deep question that natural resource managers ask all the time. That's a second grade version of an expert question. And they had to go through a whole series of investigations about what were worms' roles in ecosystems, who ate worms when they were out there. They asked things like, well, it's gross if we're all stepping on worms. But the point about it is they actually got to the should we question, should we remove worms from the sidewalk, that parallels actually expert forms of questions really fast. And you can do that in a local investigation really easily. Another was, should we be putting lights around on our pathways through the forest preserve? And they did a whole investigation about light pollution and how it changed the ecosystem to have too much light. That was a human safety issue, but too much light actually changes all kinds of interactions in forest ecosystems. And they had just never thought about it. So should we put lights up? Was another version of a should we question that actually gets you to really interesting science.
Okay, one last question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Gavin. I'm a student intern at Create for STEM. First of all, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I feel very inspired going into education. And my question is, I was just recently working in Detroit, and the schoolyard I worked in had very little to no green space. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more to how this project works in urban environments. So you do have very little actual green space and those spaces where kids can actually explore.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. So there's a couple things. So I first started doing this work in the alleys of Chicago where there's not much green space. One of the things that I think depends on how we think about this is that part of what we know is people who live in urban environments tend to think about themselves as apart from the natural world because they've forgotten to see the natural world that's all around them, actually. So green space as like forest preserve is a problem in lots of urban environments. But actually there's tons of phenomena happening all over the place. But we kind of developed, we've actually done these studies, like people don't even notice the biodiversity in urban environments anymore. Like just run roughshod over it. Or there's all kinds of really interesting fungal things happening in urban environments. So part of what I would say is that it's what we do around the learning from your schoolyard. So we have a process we call place designing. So we actually ask educators to walk a radius around their school and map the scientific phenomena that is around their schools. And that partly getting to know and doing that kind of mapping for learning opportunities around helps you start to understand, like, how could you facilitate attention and help people start to notice. And so we typically tell teachers that they need to walk their places at least 3 times. And what we start to notice is that educators who really do it, they start walking their places all the time because they start recognizing the better they know their places, the better they can map the phenomena to what's actually happening out, even if it's indicators of phenomena, they start to feel like, oh, I can teach this anywhere, or I can see many of it. Of course, just to say, I am not suggesting that learning in places should be the only model in education. I do think that it's really important to learn about ecosystems that you don't live in. But I think that there is potentially a different way to think about trajectories to doing this. And what we've actually noticed in learning in places is that, I didn't talk about this today either, but what we saw and actually what our recently immigrated kids and families taught us is that those kids and families were doing really sophisticated comparisons between the local place and their place of origin in ways that actually brought global phenomena and reasoning even to small classrooms. So my point about this is that walking local places is the first step. I often tell people I'd rather have people walk their places than to talk about their standards first. Because if you actually understand your local place, then you can map to standards really easily. But if you start with standards and you're supposed to see the standards outside, it's actually much harder. And so that's how I would start. It depends on where you are, but I've had lots of folks who will be like, well, I have railroads going through the back of my school, as an example. It's a heck of a entryway into social studies in the history of the United States if you have a railroad system in back of your school, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, is that if you start to re-see the place around you deeply connected to intellectual substance, things really open.
Great, well, why don't we give Megan a really big thank you for. And like Phil, I also want to thank you. I think it is quite amazing that basically there's 95% of us are from Michigan State, and that's very impressive that we have such a large community that's very interested in how do you promote STEM education, K through 16. So I really find this impressive. I hope next year we even grow even bigger than we are this year. But it's good to be back, and I'm glad Megan was able to lead us in in her talk. So thank you, everybody. We do have another follow-up poster session from 1:30 to 3, I believe. So hopefully people will stick around for that poster session, and then we'll see you again next year or at some of the CREATE seminars. Sure. One last point, everybody. Please do not throw your boxes away, right? We just heard a talk on sustainability, how important that is. Please take your boxes and stack them on the table over there so we can recycle our boxes. Recycle boxes.